Hi, everyone. My name is Vivian Schiller, and I'm the Executive Director of Aspen Digital, which is a program of the Aspen Institute. If you're familiar with Aspen, you would probably know that no Aspen Institute event is complete if we did not quote from an ancient Greek philosopher. So let me not disappoint you. This is from Aristotle. Man is by nature a social animal. Anyone who either cannot lead the common life or is so self-sufficient as not to need to, and therefore does not partake of society, is either a beast or a god. So thank you to Aristotle for that, although I actually prefer the way Maya Angelou said it instead. She wrote, "We need joy as we need air. We need love as we need water. We need each other as we need the earth we share." So as you probably know, we are here today to talk about loneliness and social connection and its intersection with technology, for good and sometimes for ill, especially during these times of pandemic across the globe. We are very lucky to be joined by some extraordinary panelists who you will meet in a moment. So the plan for this hour is to hear from them. We will then have a conversation. I will ask them some of my burning questions, and then we want to hear yours. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. Please, at any time starting right now, you can click on that Q&A button and enter your question. We would ask, please, that you add your name and your affiliation, maybe where you're coming from, if you are comfortable doing so. It just really helps give us that context. So again, please drop your questions into the Q&A at any time, not in the chat function. That is for sort of instructions and links. So I want to mention that this program that we're part of right now, that you're part of, is the culmination of a series of really amazing meetings that we designed and hosted together with Facebook. Facebook has a team, many of them are with us on this webinar today, focused specifically on the issues of loneliness and well-being. It is staffed by executives and academics dedicated to solutions. We found in them kindred spirits who are looking for, as we are, long-term pursuit of understanding of the future of social connection and the role that technology plays. I should also note that we will be releasing a full report in the coming weeks, so be on the lookout for that. So with that, we are now going to, let me introduce our panelists who you will meet momentarily. We will be joined by Dan Buettner. He is an explorer, National Geographic Fellow, journalist, and author. He discovered the 5 places in the world that he has dubbed blue zones. Those are places where people live the longest, healthiest lives. He now works in partnership with municipal governments, employers, and health insurance companies to implement blue zone projects. We will hear more about that from him in a minute. Brittany Cooper is co-editor of the Crunk Feminist Collection and an assistant professor at Rutgers University. She's the author of Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower, and many other books and essays. Ruth Ferhai is a clinical psychologist, the co-developer of the Friendship Bench program, and also works as a psychotherapist. Her research focuses on accessible and affordable care for common mental disorders, community-based interventions, group support, and the well-being of the counselors who work with those individuals. And finally, we will be joined by Robin Hewings. He is the Director of Campaigns, Policy and Research at the Campaign to End Loneliness. He leads a team with a presence across the UK, driving action on loneliness through research, convening, and influencing. And Robin, who will be joining me on camera right now, is going to be kicking us off with some baseline research in loneliness from his work in the UK. Keep in mind his focus is on older populations, though our conversation that will follow will be more broad. So Robin, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you now. The floor is yours. Are muted. There we go.
So I'm just sharing my screen so that you can see my slides. And hopefully that has now worked. So thank you for that introduction. I think that that encapsulates who we are really nicely. I'm just going to cover briefly a bit about who we are, what loneliness is and why it matters, and finally some reflections on the impact of COVID-19 and some idea of the way in which technology has been a real help during this time. So as Vivian said, we've had a focus on older age, which I think reflects how this issue started. Where initially people were very worried about loneliness in older people, and we formed of a coalition of organisations interested in loneliness and older people. But we're going to be moving to an all ages approach, recognising that we need to think about loneliness across the life course. So in terms of what loneliness is and what it isn't, loneliness is a subjective feeling. It's when there's a gap between the social connections we want and those that we have. And it's something which is different from social isolation. So people can be happy being by themselves and having relatively few social connections, but equally, people can be lonely in a crowd. And it's about making sure that people have the connections that they need. And sometimes those might be the connections closest to us, our kind of closest friends and family. And sometimes people can feel lonely because of that kind of broader network, saying hello to people in the shop, people you vaguely know and chat to. And the gap can be in either of those. In terms of why it matters, well, the first reason for why it matters is that there's a lot of it. So around 1 in 5 people using surveys from both the UK and also surveys from the US show that around 1 in 5 people are chronically lonely. And that means people answering yes to a question that they feel lonely always or most of the time. And the first reason for why this is something which is serious is that is kind of shown in the quote here, that this is when people feel loneliness and lack of connection is something that go right to the core of our well-being. And so when we're lonely, this is something which is immensely important in its own right, but also it has a significant impact on other areas of our life. It has an impact on our physical health, through particularly through cardiovascular disease, and the epidemiological work would suggest that its impact on mortality can be seen to be comparable to other major health risk factors that you might think of, such as lack of physical activity or smoking. You know, you can get into very interesting arguments about which precisely is more important. But I think that it's clear, and if this is something which has been recognised by government here, that it's something which is serious enough that it's something that we should definitely take action about. In terms of why people are lonely, there are a number of risk factors. Transitions are a big one, and the most important of which is bereavement, but equally becoming ill, becoming disabled, retirement, becoming blind, or losing other types of sensory loss can also be significant. And I think that we can quite easily imagine why that would be the case. And people can be lonely at any period in their lives, and people can have those transitions. There's a particular cluster of transitions in younger people as they move for education or for work, or because their friendship groups are changing a lot. Becoming a new parent can be a difficult time for loneliness, and in later life, not so much kind of people in their 50s or 60s, but as people move into their 70s, 80s or 90s, a lot of those risks can cluster. But reflecting Dan's work, a lot of it can also be about where we live. So there are some very obvious things around transport. If you can't go to places, or if there aren't places to go to, that can be a real issue. Something which people highlight in the UK quite a bit is public toilets, and particularly for older people, this is really important to make sure that they can go out and engage in their community. fear of crime, being in a place where the population is changing can be a real issue, and so that's people, and as can be not living near your family. And again, I think that the reasons for why that would impact on loneliness, I think, are probably really quite intuitive. But I think what we think is also really important, and we released a report on this last month, is that psychological factors are really important in loneliness. So there is a two-way relationship between mental health problems and loneliness. So loneliness is not a mental health problem, it's a really important part of our well-being, but it's not a diagnosable mental health problem. But having mental health problems, particularly depression, is a real risk factor for loneliness. And the key thing really is that loneliness can become a downward spiral where it affects how we think about our social relationships. We think about them more negatively. We think about going into social situations with more fear and more anxiety, and that can mean that people get stuck in loneliness. And this is the situation that we need to be most worried about. That's when we start getting into those really serious impacts on our well-being and on our physical and mental health. And we think it's an important area that needs to be addressed, both in some specifically psychological work, but also that when we think about what we need to do about loneliness, we need to think about the psychology of it as well. And so finally, I wanted to reflect briefly about some of what we've learned about the impact of COVID-19 on loneliness. In the UK, we've had a large study tracking people's psychology through the period of the pandemic. And what it's found is that people with the risk factors that I was just talking about have their loneliness has become worse. People who don't have those risk factors have often become less lonely because they've been able to spend more time with their children, for example, that they've got good social networks and they've been able to use technology well to keep in touch with people. I think just briefly reflecting on the role of government, we have a Minister for Loneliness and a loneliness strategy, and I think that has been helpful in making sure that the government thinks about loneliness through this period that has obviously created real issues for our social connections. And finally, I'm reflecting on the bigger themes of this webinar. We've been doing quite a bit of work about technology for some time, and I think that what we found is that it has been for those people who have good access to technology, which means partially about having the skills and partially about having the equipment, and also about having the financial resources to have access to technology. We found that that having the data on your phone can be a real barrier to people. Broadband packages can be really expensive, and that can similarly be a really significant barrier. And we found that to some extent, municipal governments and local community organisations have been able to find workarounds, helping more people get online, helping more people get access to the technology. And we've also seen some real dynamism and creativity of other ways of reaching people, things like kind of community bingo or doing choirs in the streets, so being able to maintain social distancing, but still some kind of contact. What we've seen survey data, those things have been useful, but not enough to kind of completely mitigate the effects that we've seen. So that's the picture that we've got from the UK, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Robin. That was really a great way to kick us off. And the UK is certainly globally a leader in taking the issues of loneliness very seriously at the national governmental level, which is really impressive. I want to drill down, just ask you a follow-up question and drill down into the last point that you made about access technology. I understand, look, I completely understand there are socioeconomic barriers where people might not have connectivity, they may not have access to devices. That is clearly a huge problem, and particularly for older generations, there are the digital skill sets. But I want to ask you sort of the flip side. For those who do have the risk factors for loneliness or self-report as experience feelings of loneliness, what kind of technology or device or internet interventions have you seen that have been effective at mitigating loneliness?
So I think that I suppose it's the ones that enable us to best keep in touch with people. So people have really valued video calls such as this, and these can be relatively basic technologies, just cell phones. And we've seen good evidence that more and more people have learned how to use these devices, and people have been often with older people, they're helped by neighbours or younger relatives, and they've been helped to use them. For people who are the oldest and who have the least contact with digital technology, there are some interesting innovations where, rather than having to kind of fiddle around with phones, some of which are, if you have, it's a little bit technical, but if you're, for older people, they lose sensation in their fingers, and it means that the touchscreen technologies don't work so well. And that can be really quite disempowering for people. But there's some innovative ways in which you can have really, really simple devices, which you just turn on, and you can have video calls that way. And so I think that we've seen some examples of general technology being useful, but also some specialized technology for people who are the furthest from using day-to-day digital.
Thanks, Robin. I want to begin to bring in the rest of our panelists and ask them some questions as well. Just a reminder to everyone, the Q&A button, we're starting to see some questions come in. Please don't forget to just click on that. If you want to ask a question, click on the Q&A button, add your question. Please list your name and your affiliation if you're comfortable doing so. That's really helpful, and we'll get to those in just a little bit. I want to turn it now over to you, Ruth. Can you describe a little bit your work at Friendship Bench and how it relates to loneliness and social connection?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you for having me on this amazing call. So with Friendship Bench, we are delivering a very easy access psychological intervention for common mental disorders, like you said in the intro, which are depression, anxiety, stress-related disorders. And we had, pre-COVID, a very simple technique, basically, where we sat on a bench. That's why it's called Friendship Bench, outside clinic premises in Zimbabwe. So this originates here in Zimbabwe. And we have figured that a lot of the people who come to primary healthcare clinics, how we call them here, are actually suffering from depression and anxiety. And in the language in Zimbabwe, it's called thinking too much. So the Zimbabwean, or the Shona language, calls it kufungisisa, which is sort of the expression for, in the Western context, we would call depression. So all symptoms in that. And so people would also often present with somatic problems. So if you think too much, you get a headache, and that's why you go to a clinic. And that's why we think it's so important to educate people around mental health issues so that they can be addressed, so that people are not given a painkiller and sent home. So we totally believe in the power of connection. So this is what it is. Our counselors who are trained and supervised are lay people. And interestingly enough, whoever maybe has heard about the Friendship Bench, many of our counselors are elderly women, which coined the term grandmothers for our intervention. And we all have this association of a grandmother having the time, having the patience, having that ability to just be present and listen non-judgmentally, just hold the space basically for someone who comes and talks. And in a context, and I think that probably is all over the world where mental health issues are stigmatized, this holding a safe space where it's where it's literally safe enough to open up and talk about feelings, and exploring what that means to talk about feelings is the key to creating meaningful human connections, we feel.
And you've recently started to use mobile phones as part of your intervention. So, which is obviously something quite different than physically sitting next to somebody on a bench, but maybe more safe during this time of pandemic. Say a little bit more about how that works.
Yes. Okay. So that was really coming out of the restrictions that were related to the COVID-19 in Zimbabwe. So obviously we felt this sitting on the bench is a great thing. We still completely believe it, and we can't wait for the moment when we can all sit on benches again. But we felt we have to protect our grandmothers, obviously, and we have to protect clients. So we extremely quickly tried to rework this, train the counselors on phone counseling, which is a little bit different because we often can't do video calls, or actually hardly ever do video calls because of what you said as well, Robin, about costs, availability of smartphones, connections, all those things in our setting, and in other low and middle income settings are probably even worse when it comes to this. So it is text-based, call-based. Often we get the information, though, that people would like to have a first face-to-face meeting and then continue on the phone. But nevertheless, we seem to be reaching clientele who would otherwise go to the clinic and meet the grandmother there, and now is basically on the phone with the grandmother within the same community. But we also offer something which is reaching out a little bit more nationally and internationally. And what we get is that people are feeling they're heard. They are having that space where they can talk. But again, it is, of course, very limited when you see whatever your data running low or your money running out. And we have a lot of challenges in terms of people not having the privacy. They live in crowded living circumstances where they're sharing a phone. So that can be an issue if you text with someone and someone else picks up the phone because they want to make a call or they get a call. So this is all something that has to be mitigated, and it's not as easy as it could have been maybe in a safer environment around the bench.
So with those limitations, of course, coming back again to those socioeconomic conditions and restrictions, nonetheless, using phones might be able to give you sort of broader access. So certainly a double-edged sword there. Brittany, I want to come to you. You've been such a wonderful contributor to some of our previous discussions that we co-hosted with Facebook, and you've pointed out that systemic conditions driving feelings and loneliness are particularly acute for certain communities, underrepresented communities. Can you expand on that from your research?
I'm sure. So thank you, Vivian. Thanks to all of you. One of the things that made me begin to think about this was when we saw the uprisings over the summer, in the earlier part of the summer in the late spring, we saw so many young people of color out in the streets, even though we were under COVID restrictions. And it was clear to me as I watched the kind of movement out into the streets that at least one of the things motivating people beyond our outrage over the killing of George Floyd was the social isolation, that we had isolation fatigue and that people really needed to be connected. And so there was a way that there was a kind of efficacy of being able to go out into the streets, see people, protest, feel like you were doing something to respond to the moment. So that's one of the things that helped me to recognize that there was a kind of social aspect to protest. But the other place that we came to deal with this problem of loneliness in my field in the academy was in 2010 when we started the Crunk Feminist Collective blog, which is a collective of women of color, hip hop generation feminists. We write about popular culture and feminism and all of those things. But we did it to combat this deep sense among people of color, particularly young women of color coming through the academy, that were isolated in various locales, didn't have a sense of community. And so we built an online community, in part because I was living in Alabama at the time, and I was a single Black woman living in a fairly isolated place. And even though Alabama's fairly racially diverse, the university space is not particularly diverse. And so this became a way for me to connect with other women of color who were in that journey. And we found that we built a really powerful community and a way to actually speak to people's concerns. And so in that way, we began to build a digital tool where folks could come, find people who were like-minded, and express their opinions and feel like they were heard. I think that one of the things that doing that work though has taught me, particularly about how to build platforms, and we built a platform across Facebook, Twitter, we use Tumblr, we use Ning back in the day, a kind of older tool. But I also wonder and worry about the way that, on the one hand, what digital tools allow us to do is connect to people who, when we feel like we can't find our people, digital tools allow you to find your people. And we spend a lot of time in my work talking about the importance of having a crew to navigate whatever place you're in. The other thing, though, is that I also find this curious thing, particularly in the social justice spaces in which I live and move, where people are both intensely connected, but are also always talking about how no one understands them and they feel so silenced by the process. And so in a moment where everyone has access to the platform that Facebook allows many of us to have, or Twitter, Instagram, all of that, at the same time, it doesn't seem to be combating people's deep sense that they are misunderstood and they are not unheard, that they are unheard, and that they want to have a voice in the world and that they want that voice to be valued. And so I both think that it has combated one part of the problem and also introduced this other part of the problem, which is this hierarchy about who then gets to be heard in particular spaces. So I'll give you one example and then I'll stop. I dealt with some harassment in the early part of the summer because of comments I made in my political work. And so I had to reach out to some teams at Facebook to help me with safety measures. And so they gave me one of those blue check marks that says your account has been verified. And so now every time I'm on Twitter or Facebook and people see the blue check mark, I get all these comments about how do I get a blue check mark, right? And so there's even a sense that verification gives my voice more value in the space. And so even when I'm just having conversations with people, they're like, well, who are you and why do you get a blue check mark? And I wonder about that because it suggests to me that even in the places where we feel connected, people still have this acute sense that there's a hierarchy, and that in a moment where everyone could ostensibly have an opportunity to speak, that there are still structures that are built in to say that certain voices have more value. And there's a lot of hand wringing and anxiety about that.
Yeah, do you have a hypothesis in your work about how to mitigate that effect?
I don't yet. I'm thinking about this. In some ways, I just try to call it out for people. One of the things that I think is a bit of a danger is that, when we combat loneliness through connection, sometimes the basis of our connections can be unhealthy though. So we see one of the reasons that, social media is having to spend a lot of time combating misinformation and all of that is because people are connected by their anger and their fear. So they're combating loneliness, but we've also got to then figure out how to mediate the unhealthy emotions that sometimes undergird the basis of the connection. And that is a problem I'm thinking a lot about, because anger and rage can bring us together, but there's both righteous rage and unrighteous rage, right? And we have a problem in our politics right now where we're not distinguishing very well between righteous rage and unrighteous rage. And we're all trying to find the people who are mad about the same things that we're mad about. And so then we find our communities, but then sometimes the way that folks act out their sense of, I'm not isolated, I found my group, I found my people, is that they then swarm people online who don't think like them, right? They sort of come together as a group and they use it as so there's a way that we feel emboldened when we find our people. That's positive, but that newfound power can also make us act in ways that are not particularly great for our social fabric. So I just think we have a lot of work to do to then A, combat loneliness and isolation, but then B, to actually ask people to imagine what a healthy basis for connection looks like.
Right. Righteous rage. That's excellent. Yeah. Okay. So we're now going to thank you, Brittany. We'll come back to you some more in the audience questions. Dan, talk to us about blue zones and how do we find what is a blue zone and how do I get there as fast as possible?
Don't walk.
Yeah.
Well, the idea was, in a sense, to reverse engineer longevity. So on assignment for National Geographic and with funding from the National Institutes on Aging, we hired demographers to find areas where people live statistically longest. And because only about 20% of how long you live is dictated by genes, the other 80% is lifestyle or something else, we sought to find the common denominators. And I've been working on this for 15 years with a number of other, well, the number of great scientists. I'm not a scientist, but I can draw scientists in. But to the point of today's conversation, we were recognizing 15 years ago that loneliness was not a factor in blue zones. People weren't lonely. And my first book, The Blue Zones, we were calling out the lack of loneliness as an explanation for some of their longevity. And this is only coming to the fore right now. And by the way, I applaud you guys and the Institute for recognizing it. If the pharmaceutical company could come up with a drug that eliminated loneliness, it'd be a multi-billion-dollar blockbuster drug. But it's not something that the medical community generally can address with a profit. So it's not something at their fore. So why don't people in blue zones suffer from loneliness? It's not because they have better technology, not because they don't suffer from the same sort of psychological maladies that the rest of us do. It's mainly because of their built environment. They live in places where every time they step out their front door, they're bumping into people and these serendipitous connections throughout the day. And by the way, there is good research that shows that these sort of non-planned, light touch social interactions, such as interacting with a barista or your postman or just somebody randomly on the street, predicts longevity better than diet and exercise. So you cannot possibly underestimate the importance of addressing loneliness. But as Robin, and by the way, I thought that was a phenomenal presentation, as he points out, north of 20% of people in the United States and probably many other countries are suffering from loneliness, which shaves about 8 years off of their life expectancy. So you say to yourself, how are we going to address, 20% of 330 million, 66 million people with loneliness, and do it fast because they're dying soon? And I assert it's taking a page from what we observe very clearly in these longest lived areas, blue zones, and that's think about how we design our environment. And rather than living in suburbs and cul-de-sacs where we're isolated, and I know we have COVID now and we have to be careful on how we socially interact and socially distance and mask and so forth. Nevertheless, our species evolved successfully because of our ability to socially connect and cooperate. And that is hardwired into our genes. And in order for us to thrive optimally, we need cities where it's easy to walk places, it's easy to bike places, it's safe feeling. Take a page from places like Boulder, Colorado, or Portland, Oregon, where they report very low levels of loneliness. And part of the reason I believe is because they have a green belt around the city that eliminates sprawl and turns in all sort of vitality, economic vitality and social vitality to a core that has restaurants and streets and biking lanes. And I know it's vogue to address health problems and other problems by some sort of technology solution, but I'm a strong believer that's not going to get us where we are. Like, I enjoy talking to you guys on Zoom right now, but I would much rather be sitting face to face with you and feel the human connection, which I don't exactly feel. I'm looking at a screen right now and I see little tiny, matchbook size images of your face. It's just not the same. I think technology is useful to help us set up plans to connect with each other later in person. But I think that the immediate, most cost-effective and massively effective way to address this loneliness epidemic is to optimize our built environments to bring people together instead of letting them continue to flow apart.
Is it too early into the pandemic for you to have any findings about how the global pandemic has impacted what you're saying? Because almost everything you're describing, it requires people to partake in, not everything, but unsafe activities right now. That kind of gathering in person, that really intimate human to human connection, you know, it's cities, period.
Well, you know, in our Blue Zone project cities, take Fort Worth, Texas. They've been very aggressive around. They worked with us for 4 years. We managed to lower loneliness and we managed to lower their BMI. It takes years for city planners to embrace these complete streets or active living plans, get them passed through city council and getting them in place. So, you know, we can be in a little bit crouching tiger mode right now. I don't think we should be using the COVID pandemic as an excuse not to address these things. Again, I'm talking about physical changes to the environment. These things, they're not impossible. They take planning, they take years, and they take will, and they take a willingness to see clearly the connection between the data and what works. And, you know, that there's often incentives that prevent us from seeing clearly. But you know, we should be starting right now. And by the way, I lived part of my year in Santa Barbara, California. All the restaurants are al fresco. The main street, since COVID, by the way, it's called State Street, that has turned to a pedestrian mall. So we got the cars out of there. People wear masks. So I would argue it's because of COVID been a more socially connected environment than it was before. So lots of great opportunities. I don't think we should use COVID as an excuse.
We are now going to, thank you so much, Dan. We're now going to, we'll likely come back to that. We're now going to begin to move to your questions. Again, a reminder, Q&A button at the bottom. Please add your name, your affiliation, where you're coming from. That is very helpful. So I don't know that we're going to be able to get to all of your questions, but we certainly want to get to some of them. So it's a question to you, Ruth. This is from Angie Yoder-Mena with the Green String Network, coming to us from Nairobi. So do you have any experience with WhatsApp or other networking apps to work with the peer groups for Friendship Bench? Particularly interested in how this might be received in the African context.
Right, thank you for that question. Yes, we are basically only using the WhatsApp platform because it seems to be exactly what people here on the African continent have access to and what works quite reliably. And so we do groups with WhatsApp, and there's a cap how many people you can have in a group though. So we try to do moderated groups more for our youth Friendship Bench application, how we call it. And we also sort of use WhatsApp as the connecting bit. When I say we talk over the phone, it's all WhatsApp based, and it can be, like I said, texting or calling. Yeah, I hope this, and it's very well received from that point of view, if people have the right access to technology and all the other things that you need for it.
This one is from Christopher Baranovsky, who would like the panelists to talk about social media more broadly and how it may have contributed to loneliness, particularly that the limitations imposed by digital media and platforms delimit the capacity for deep emotional connection and pose risk of social media addiction. So I think that he's getting here at what you're talking about, what you were getting at a little bit, Dan, which is we're seeing each other as little boxes, which is not quite the emotional connection. So I wonder if who would like to address that? Robin, maybe you have had, oh, okay. I'll let Robin say a couple of words and then I'll turn it over to you, Ruth.
So I think that making comparisons about loneliness between different times and places is always quite tricky because people answer the questions in somewhat different ways. But we do have some data from the UK focused on older people that would say that it would appear that loneliness hasn't gone up or down that much. And I think that's because while some things have become more challenging for loneliness, other things have helped. So, for example, if someone emigrated in the 1950s, you would never speak to them again if they were moving to Australia, as many people were doing from England at that time. Whereas now you'd be very able to keep in quite close touch. But I think to the question, I think that so there are some ways in which technology and digital technology can be helpful. So a solution to a response to loneliness is not about finding new people, but just keeping in touch with old friends or reigniting old friendships. And social media can obviously be really helpful for that. But I think where there's a clear danger is around the kind of social comparison that can very much happen on, particularly on things like Facebook. Everyone else's life looks brilliant and rich. And in a way, as Brittany was saying, in terms of political activism, there's a way in which there's a kind of social comparison there that can feel perhaps a little alienating as well. So I think that in many ways we're kind of at the early stage of using digital technologies, and over time we need to get better at it so that it becomes helpful for our connections and not something which can make us overly compare with other people, and then that can kind of make us feel left out and less successful. So,
right, that is something that does echo Brittany's remarks. I'd like to come to Brittany in a minute, but Ruth, first, I know you wanted to say something on this.
Thank you so much. You just prepared the ground for me, because I wanted to go on from a psychological point of view. If I look at someone else's great life, I tend to sort of devalue myself, and I create a whole lot of distrust between people, right? Because then next time I'll post a photo, it also has to be extremely great. That means people sort of potentially move away from who they really are, and that will contribute to this distrust, which I think sort of causes a high level of sort of low level anxiety, if that makes sense, which makes us be afraid of connections in a way. And I think because we all lack that distress tolerance, like to be able to sit with it. So we kind of rather sort of move back or whatever. The one thing that I wanted to say, just the difference between loneliness and solitude, where loneliness can become completely dysfunctional after a while, but in the beginning, it should just be a symbol for, or a signal for, move forward, find someone. You're longing, you want to create belonging, go for it, right? Where solitude, which I think in the past is actually another word for the same concept, was seen as something where you're turning inward and you're learning from yourself, right? And if I'm lonely and I reach out, in a way, I'm also just patching up something. I need to practice solitude, that's that distress tolerance, and I need to learn to sit with what's going on and be with myself. And I think that's something we all should practice more in some form or other, and not immediately reach out and make this feeling go away. So that was just my point.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Brittany, I want to just come back to you on this as well, because you were speaking earlier about how this sense of inequity sometimes people can experience that, why don't I have a blue check mark, which we'll use that as a metaphor for something much, much larger. Do you also get the sense that this causes people to either withdraw or to pretend that they're somebody that they're not, and how that might exacerbate feelings of loneliness?
Yes, I think that there's a whole new kind of economy about self-value that has emerged in the wake of people being on social media and having, as Ruth points out, these hyper curated selves. And so we are constantly in a mode of self-comparison. And part of what that means is that people forget, even though we are personally all curating which pictures we share, which thoughts we share, we forget that other people are also making those kinds of choices, and that they're typically showing us their best selves and not their worst days. And so I think that in among social activists, there is a lot of conversation about silencing, about how people, like, again, don't understand them and they're struggling to come to voice. And it's always shocking to me as someone who grew up right on the digital cusp. So I remember word processors and, life before the internet. And then as a teenager, learned what the internet was and got to use it. And so it's been a part of my life for longer than it hasn't. But even my formative years not being rooted around internet and social media shifts your perspective. And so when I talk to folks and I'm like, but we have an unprecedented level of democratization of access to conversation, to voice, and the ability to share our opinions, but people want to be heard. And at the core of feeling lonely is the sense that there's no one in your life that is a witness to you, your life, and the things that are going on, no one that is there to hear you and understand you, and sort of like reflect you back to yourself. And so I think that I think that social media can be a very tough mirror. And I think that we have to figure out how to create communities with each other that are low risk. Because the other thing that's a challenge too is that when you share part of yourself on social media or on digital tools, there's a sense that there's always a trail, always a trace. So you can't, make mistakes because it can be thrown in your face at any time, that sort of thing. And so we've got to figure out, like, what is a low stakes mode of connection? And the digital seems to promise that it's a low stakes mode because you're in your house. You don't actually have to have flesh and blood meetings with people. And then you realize that there's a record and a trace of the things you said, did, the pictures you shared, all of those things. And so then all of a sudden the stakes shift again. And so I think we have to figure that out. And while I'm talking, let me offer one additional thing. I was listening to Dan and thinking about blue zones and thinking that's super useful, but also thinking, like, a lot of those places, Dan, other than Fort Worth, Texas, which is fairly diverse, are super white. They're super white and fairly affluent. And I wonder about blue zone living in places where you have people of color, where you have Black folks, where you have folks that are sort of poor. Because I'm thinking about Portland, which is a lovely place and has a great food scene, but it is mega white. It is super duper white. And I'm like, I would never move to Portland. Like, if that's my only two options here in the US, and so part of what I'm asking is whether whiteness or the fact that in some of these places is not American people of color, is that the thing that helps them to be blue zones? Because there's access to wealth, affluence, good food, lack of food deserts. You can choose to live in the center of town because you can actually afford to. So I wonder you're thinking about that with regard to blue zones.
Well, just to be clear about blue zones, the original blue zones are in Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, Nicoya Peninsula, Costa Rica, which is Latin America, among the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California, and Ikaria, Greece. Separately, I have a organization that helps cities that decide they want to get healthier by changing their environment, their food policy, their built environment, and certifying their restaurants, grocery stores, workplaces, et cetera. And that we are completely agnostic as to what cities we go into. We're invited in by mayors. We're currently invited in by Austin, Texas, and Orlando, also very racially diverse. And we work in cities where the public sector wants it and pledges to making the change, and we can get private sector funding, which is usually from insurance companies and hospital systems. So our interventions are agnostic, and we generally are of the attitude that if you create a built environment that is safe, that nudges people out from behind their steering wheel onto their feet, bumping into people, that is going to help them no matter what their race, color, creed, or sexual orientation is. And that's sort of our approach. When it comes to social media, there's very good research that shows the loneliest demographic right now are millennials. And not coincidentally, they are also the ones using the most social media. And incidentally, their loneliness started to peak right after about 2011 when this thing, handhelds, came on as being ubiquitous. So, it's a correlation, but I still argue that at least with the current technology, looking for an answer to loneliness and some gadget is misguided.
Well, I'm sure there's multiple points of view on that. Certainly,
of course, I'm the counterbalance.
would argue differently, and I would argue differently in my ability to stay in touch with them. Then, actually, that was a perfect segue into some questions, other questions we've had from people who are watching and listening to us now around adolescence. I will read both of these questions because I think they pair nicely together. The first one is from Emily Wellborn with the Watkins Museum of History in Lawrence, Kansas. She asks, how do you believe this pandemic will affect adolescents' social development in the long term, and how can local institutions do more to help? The second question related is from Steve Asher from Duke University, who has been Nice that you're with us, Steve. He was part of one of our other roundtables that we hosted with Facebook, who asked, compared to older people, a much smaller percentage of children, adolescents, and college students report high levels of loneliness or chronic loneliness. But still, it is concern when it occurs, and it might be of special concern for youth who miss a lot of school for health reasons, disabilities, caretaking of siblings, etc. Are you aware of efforts to use technology to help youth in these circumstances to stay together? So again, technology to help youth connect now that they're in isolation from the pandemic, and what local institutions can do to help. Robin, you may want to take on about the social institutions. I know you focus mostly on the elderly population, but I know you're branching out now into other demographics.
Yes, that's right. I think that we did some work about how technology can help to tackle loneliness, and there are some ways in which the examples I use about adolescents who are out of school for a long period of time, and there are some devices that can help people stay in touch with their friends. It's a device where you have, it looks a bit like a robot that goes into a classroom, so that people can still connect from hospital, for example, into their classroom, and so they can still feel some of that kind of connection that they might have. It's not a very cheap device, so I think it's not something which is going to be really rolled out, but I think it makes a point that in terms of what can local institutions do, I think awareness of this and understanding of the importance of connection and finding different ways of sustaining it. As I say, there's a kind of a funny robot technology type thing that can be useful, but there are other ways in which people can stay in touch. A nice example that we've had during COVID that my children have been involved with is writing letters to care homes. So this is a way in which younger primary school aged children, so children are kind of 7, 8, 9, 10, can keep in touch with older people and have an interesting kind of conversation between the two. So, and that's, I suppose, something which is partially about physically writing letters, so it seems quite old school, as it were, but also it's a way in which people can, it's actually the way in which we actually made it happen was very much through all of the kind of administrative tools of modern digital technology.
Great. While I've got you, I'm just going to ask you a question looking back at the older populations. This is a question from Patty David with AARP. Do you see, this is just a short one, but do you see social online games, game playing impacting loneliness in any way? Or is it the same barrier of fear of the technology or inability to use it?
So I think that that can be because that can be a way of bringing people into being online, and people who are gamers talk a lot about how it can be, and there's really striking examples of people don't want to be sat opposite each other, eyeballing each other, doing things that they find enjoyable together can be great. And there's some intergenerational examples of that, of younger people and older people playing together. But absolutely, older people can play online games together, and that can be a great way of connecting, because in a way, people don't go to the loneliness club. People combat loneliness by doing things that they find interesting and fun and meaningful. And absolutely, game playing can be one of the ways in which people can stay in touch with each other.
Coming back to adolescence before we leave that, because I drew you all the way back to the other end of the spectrum there for a minute. I want to ask our other panelists about anything in particular that you're seeing in terms of risk factors for adolescents and risk of loneliness or social isolation during the pandemic. Ruth, I don't know if Friendship Bench focuses on that demographic.
We do. So yeah, thank you. We do focus on that demographic, but I also must say, in our context, there is not as much physical isolation as maybe in your countries. I think it's just not possible for people who live in a township kind of scenario to be locked up at home. People have to go out and get water. People have to go out and get food. People have to somehow struggle for their hand-to-mouth job in a day. So I don't see that as a point. What I see in Zimbabwe, though, is that, for instance, school hasn't really happened for now almost 6 months for a lot of people. And I have heard from Kenya, for instance, that they have just said the whole school year is written off. Everybody has to repeat the school year. So I see a lot of children playing on the streets. I see a lot of activity. I'm not worried about children not having social connections in our context, and I suppose many other low and middle income countries. What I do see, though, is if children see their parents struggle extremely because of the effects of the COVID and the breakdown of socioeconomic networks and stuff, that children will suffer from that. And we already have high levels of interpersonal violence happening in our setting, and this is, and I think we get data from all over the world that this is happening more and more, and I think that's an issue. That definitely is a problem. If people lack coping mechanisms because they just have never been trained them, and they're now put into situations where the fear of something invisible, chronic, is just constantly around them, which our brains are not made for, that will seek some way out, and then aggression is one way. And Brittany, you described that also quite well, how people will show emotions, which is good in a way, but again, if it's not channeled in the right way, can be destructive.
We are really living through a massive global social experiment that I think will take years to really unpack and understand. We're coming up on time, so I want to just give Dan an opportunity to speak again, and then Brittany will give you the last word. Particular focus on young people, risk factors, and opportunities for young people during a time when their lives are so disrupted. Dan, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Brittany.
Yes. So, well, this is slightly tangential, but I think it's really important. It's to take some time to do an internal inventory to know what you're good at, what you like to do, and what your gifts are, what an outlet for those are, and also taking stock of your social circle. We know that if your 3 best friends are obese and unhealthy, there's 150% better chance that you'll be overweight. Alcohol use, drug use, and even loneliness is contagious. So when we're imploding in our homes, it's an ideal opportunity to take that inventory in both purpose and your social network. And by the way, I was a little hasty at writing off technology. I do think technology can work. I just think the most immediate answer right now at scale is looking to our built environment.
Yeah, well, certainly the answer lies in that blend. Brittany, just the last word, since we're really running out of time, I would just love any thoughts that you have, particularly around younger generations, of course, which you are part of, and the risks and the opportunities there. And unfortunately, I have to ask you to keep it pretty short.
Yes. So I'll just say this quick thing that gave me a lot of hope. I've been doing some organizing in the last few weeks around the case of a 15-year-old Black girl named Grace, that's her pseudonym, who was locked up in Michigan. She was on probation from late 2019. And then when the pandemic hit, she has a disability, she has ADHD, and she wasn't doing her homework. And that was a condition of her probation. And so a judge locked her up and put her in a juvenile facility in the middle of a pandemic, which was against all of, the sort of practices that medical professionals had recommended there in Michigan. So there had been a groundswell, ProPublica reported on it, and then we did activism and organizing. This week, she was released 2 weeks ago and then taken off of probation this week. And I had a chance to meet with the 2 17-year-old Black girls that did a bunch of organizing on her behalf. And they were super inspiring. But what we just need to be reminded of is that young people are having a range of responses to what it means to be in the house. For some young people, it's a breath of fresh air, particularly if they were dealing with bullying and social isolation in school. For kids who really found their communities at school, being pulled out of those communities has been incredibly hard for them to deal with. And many of them have like gone back to doing sports, even though it has been, again, you know, not good for their health to do that, because they're deeply in need of social connection. But there are broader structural constraints when people are dealing with loneliness and dealing with isolation and a disruption of routine. And when we're talking about Black and brown youth, sometimes what that means is that they have social consequences that are generationally far-reaching and traumatic. So we do have to think about how to give young people the tools to stay connected in ways that feel life-giving for them, because it isn't for adults where they can simply adjust and figure, you know, process and figure out what they need. They don't have the same tools we have. And so we have to advocate for them. But I'm very happy that we used technology. We used Instagram, we used back channel old school organizing, and we used a letter writing campaign for Grace in order to help her to get free and to help young women who organize on her behalf find their voice. And I think that that story illustrates all the wonderful things about what technology can do for us, but also reminds us that it has fundamental limitations. And that, as Dan pointed out earlier, we've got to think about technology as a conduit to connection and not merely as the sole means of connection.
Brittany, I could not have scripted a more perfect finale for this session. That was absolutely spot on. Thank you so much to you. Thank you to Robin and Ruth and Dan. Thank you to Facebook for being such great partners. And we'll see, look for a recording of this later on Aspen Digital Twitter feed and our report coming out later. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.